All right, so this is the content I would have covered had we had the time on the symbolic interactionist perspective and how it approaches a study of poverty and experiences of being poor. Like we did in class, I'll encourage you to pause the video actually and take a minute and jot down some of the concepts, ideas, the words that come to mind when you try and remember what you've already know about symbolic interactionism as a perspective and as a theory. And when you got a couple of those, then hit play again and let's continue. So symbolic interactionism is I didn't want to go there yet, sorry. It's a theory that doesn't try to explain why we have stratification, why we have inequality in society in the first place. Instead, it mostly is a theory that examines the differences that inequality makes for people's lifestyles and their interactions with other people. So, as its name implies, it focuses on the interactions between people and the symbols that we use in those interactions. So the focus of this perspective is on how meanings, labels, definitions affect and are affected by social life. Society, they argue, is made up of shared meanings, shared definitions, shared interpretations that are held by everyone in that particular society. And we use those shared meanings, those shared definitions in all of our interactions with people. Now, an offshoot of symbolic interactionism is the social constructionism theory. And it allows us specifically a look at social inequalities, poverty in particular, by focusing on the ways in which social inequalities are constructed in society, or how social inequalities are collectively imagined by the members of that society. And so they carry with them this understanding, the assumption that social inequalities are not something natural or inevitable given a particular society's construction. Instead, we as a society come to collective meanings and understandings of what is inequality, what is poverty. And just as we can construct those, we can actually deconstruct those and change those. So make a note of that in terms of how social change might happen as a result of this theory. So the theory calls attention to the ways in which a society defines things like wealth and poverty, deserving and undeserving, some of the things we've covered already. And a condition must be defined or recognized as a social problem in order for it to be defined and understood collectively as a social problem. And Herbert Blumer has developed a series of stages that help us understand how problems come to be defined as social problems. So very simple stages in the sense that first a problem is born, and what this means is that a group of people have gotten together and they have identified something as a problem, and they have been able to collectively identify the cause or the persons involved and at fault for that particular problem. They then try to convince others that this is a problem and for the reasons why they feel it's a problem. So the second stage is social legitimation, and they try and get others involved in this process of seeing this as a problem from this perspective, as well as then moving into the third stage, which is mobilizing for action. So how do we deal with this problem? How do we eradicate this problem? So it's usually a particular group that starts this process and the definition of what's wrong, and then therefore how to fix it. And if we bring in some of the other theories we're looking at, particularly conflict theory, usually it's some more powerful groups, it's more dominant groups that have more power in the sense that their definitions of what is a problem and how they deal with it gets mobilized and gets put into action versus less powerful groups. So we've seen this a little bit before, and some of the things that sort of work into this stage development of problems when we were looking at defining poverty as a social problem, we went through this particular checklist, if you remember, and these are some things that work into that definition process in terms of, is there claim on public attention? Is it the result of a public policy? Is it having particularly problematic social or economic consequences in society? Often who's involved in the problem is determinant whether or not it's going to be seen by others as a problem. As we've talked about, it's really easy for other people to get behind a definition of child poverty versus young adult poverty. There's a bit more persuasion there for child poverty because of who they are as a group of people. So this material from earlier in the course fits into the symbolic interactionist perspective in this way. Now, the theory also calls attention to the consequences of being labeled, in our case here, poor. And they use the particular theory called labeling theory to understand this process. And we've covered this before when we were looking at defining poverty as an individual problem here. We know that individuals who are poor, especially those who are receiving social assistance or welfare, they're often labeled as being not only poor, but they're often labeled also as being lazy, irresponsible, or lacking in abilities, motivation, or moral values. And so the symbolic interactionist perspective, labeling theory in particular, focuses on how these meanings, how these definitions, how these labels come about, how they get applied, and what happens once they're applied to people, and how that impacts on their interactions with other people in society. And so we know, there's been lots of qualitative research on this area, particularly around poverty, that demonstrates that the experience of poverty, and particularly getting that label of poor, it involves some really serious psychological dimensions in terms of people, starting to feel powerless, voiceless. They start to feel dependent. They feel shame. They feel humiliation. And all of those experiences are the result of the interactions that they have with other people who see them as poor. So the labeling theory rests on this premise that a given activity is analyzed under the rubric of social inequalities only if groups of people define that as a problem, as an inequality. And we know that we evaluate each other in respect to the various attributes or statuses that we possess. And sometimes some of those attributes carry with them a stigma, a negative stigma. And a stigma is just a particular kind of negative social perception of certain human attributes. Erving Goffman is a symbolic interactionist theorist you've come across before, and he identified 3 types of stigma. Physical stigma, so that's attributes such as physical defects or deformities or anything that's observable physical to the person. The second type of stigma is tribal stigma, which refers to attributes such as ethnicity or nationality or religion. So it's tribal in terms of kind of like community or group belonging, tribal in that respect. And then the third type of stigma is stigmas or blemishes, he called them, I like that word, blemishes of individual character. And these are things like things that are known about the person. So some of the examples of blemishes of individual character, when we know someone has a criminal record or an addiction or mental disorder, those would be blemishes of, or stigmas of individual character. So if we were in class and face to face, we'd pause here and I would get you to think about some examples of all 3 of these as it relates to poverty. So what are some of the physical stigma that we associate with poverty? A little bit harder might be the tribal stigma, but definitely also the stigma or blemishes of individual character. You should be able to come up with some examples of that. So if it helps, think in mind of the population that you're looking at, and they might have some different stigma in this regard to other groups. So pause that, make some examples, and then hit play again, and we've got a little bit more here to cover. Now, all of these types of stigmas, interfere with the interactions, the normal interactions that people have with one another, because of the belief that poverty it contains some of these other undesirable characteristics, like a lack of effort or laziness or some moral failings on the part of a person. And so those things get carried into those interactions that the poor have with other people. And so they determine how other people who are not poor interact with the poor. But the stigma also impacts on how the individual, the poorer individual, interacts and enters into those relationships. And we know that in response to stigmas, people do certain things and behave in patterned ways. And in this case, in response to the stigma of being poor, the poor develop certain traits or behaviors that are quite noticeable, and they could lead into what we covered earlier, that the culture of poverty that Lewis, the researcher, identified there years ago. So again, Goffman, he's done most of the work in this area that we still use today. He identified 3 strategies that people who have been stigmatized engage in order to deal with interactions with non-stigmatized people. So the 3 strategies are: 1, they'll try to associate. So the poor, the stigmatized poor, will associate with those who possess the same stigma, or only associate with people who, they'll associate with normal people who are sympathetic toward their stigma. So they'll either associate with other stigmatized people, likewise stigmatized people, or normal people who sympathize with people with that stigma. That's one strategy. Another strategy is they'll work to try and hide their stigma or that stigmatized identity from normal people. So they'll engage in some behaviors, physical or behavioral characteristics that will try and hide that stigma, that label. And thirdly, they may act on the meanings that normal persons give them. And in the sense that they may actually come to adopt some of the stereotypical expectations of people who are poor, or at least in that category. So they actually might come to reflect some of the characteristics we have, unfortunately labeled and lumped into that particular label. So they might give into, the laziness, or they might appear to be and behave as if they can't be independent or self-sufficient. So they come to embody and exhibit those stigmatized definitions. And so this is part of, again, going back to that culture of poverty that Lewis identified and is covered in your readings there. Some of the traits that he identified as the culture of poverty might be this acting on that stigmatized meanings strategy that Goffman identified. So, for example, he just to quote Lewis, he talked about the people in the culture of poverty have strong feelings of marginality, of helplessness, of dependency, of not belonging. Along with this feeling of powerlessness is a widespread feeling of inferiority and of personal unworthiness. And so those traits, the people come to act on those traits, and other symbolic interactionists, labeling theorists, researchers have actually argued that people come to believe those about themselves, those particular stigmatized traits about themselves. And so this is sort of optional material. It's not in any of your reading, but I wanted to throw this in here because you might have come across some of these ideas in other courses. I certainly cover this in criminology when we're talking about criminal labels. The same processes, the same theories apply here, because these are theories of labeling theories was originally developed to explain the labeling of anyone who's deviant and not normal in any way. And so in particular, Howard Becker's work talks about tagging, which is the same as labeling. Once people get tagged or labeled with a negative and a negative label like being poor, then that stigma, is forever sort of attached to them, and it hides and it sort of obscures any other positive traits that they might have or positive labels that they might have. And then that's what makes it really difficult for that person to integrate or to be a part of normal society, because that stigma is preventing their total inclusion. Frank Tannenbaum is an earlier